My name is Derek Hand, and I'm the faculty of the dean of. I'm the dean of the faculty of the. What day is this? The dean of the faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Indeed, I am, and I'm very glad to be so. And I want to welcome you all here today to the faculty and to DCU for this annual conference. And it's great to see so many people and actually familiar faces from previous conferences. There is nothing more important, I think, than the climate and the environment. And I think a gathering such as this each year allows us to look at that problem from varying perspectives. So today I'm the chair of this panel, the Arts and the Environment. And we have four panelists. We have Rosie O'Reilly, visual artist and Dublin City Council's first biodiversity artist in residence. We have Kerri, Dochartaigh, writer, who has written short stories and biography and novels. We have Luke Casserly, multidisciplinary performance maker and Dublin City Council's second biodiversity artist in residence. We have also my colleague Ellen Howley, who is a lecturer in the DCU School of English. And while I'm the dean, I'm also come out of the School of English. So it's great to see Ellen here. I think the idea of considering the climate and the environment from an artistic perspective, and we've got different arts being represented here, literary arts, pictorial arts, performance art, and so on. I think for me, it's the idea that art can give us a narrative around this crisis and not just tell a story around it, but tell a story in a way that we can engage with it, perhaps try to understand it. Art can generate feeling in terms of emotions that are both positive and negative, but also that sense of empathy, I suppose. So again, hugely important. And obviously art allows us to see the world in a variety of ways, perhaps makes us see the world again as if for the first time. And perhaps that's something we constantly need to be aware of in a moment such as this, when the environment and the climate is under such pressure, that we can see it again as if for the first time and perhaps begin to, I suppose, re-embrace it as something important and delicate and something that needs to be minded, I suppose. So that kind of general context, I think, is important. So in terms of that introduction, what we will do now is we will go and begin to sort of talk to each of the panelists around their individual work and what they think is important in terms of their art and the environment. And of course, we will leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So first of all, Rosie, tell us a little bit about yourself and your art. Yes. At all?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Just a nod, Dígrich Gachtainna, first of all, but a nod to the speakers we had this morning, an incredible testament to the work that's being done internationally and the important work that needs to be done. My background, it was lovely sitting through it. I studied sociology and philosophy as my primary degree and then went on to set up NGOs in the human rights sector related to textiles and clothing production mainly. So I was living through those stories when we worked on conversations around fires in factories in Turkey, for example, the loss of life internationally due to the electronics industry and the textile industry, which of course we're all part of. I had an arts practice simultaneously, and I'm sitting here now with the very great privilege of talking about, I suppose, the reasons why I work through art methodologies as a way to communicate these stories. For me, I imagine it as a space that is a hybrid space. I don't think art necessarily gives you something. I think it is something. I imagine it, if you can kind of, to go straight into the material context, a space that resembles something like the inside of a sea sponge. When you're there, you're not sure where you are. It's vulnerable. It can move at any direction at any time. It isn't siloed. I came from sociology and philosophy. I recognise the siloing that's evident in academic research, but also academic funding. The windmill on our panel was already identified as an icon of this conference. There's questions to be asked fundamentally about the extractive futures of this country specifically, and I'm working on a project at the moment in relation to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about art methodologies and research practices. I'm footnoting, I suppose, Shoes Martinet is a great curator from Spain when I use these words, that the practice is understand as a substance that questions materiality, technologies, and different places of knowledge. And that is a key place we need right now in the poly crisis that we're within. And for me, as I moved through this language of arts, where you pick up a material, you respond to a space, and you interrogate and problematize the space you're in, art allowed me to do that. Whether I was standing within, I work collaboratively and in embedded research at I suppose, the nexus of art and science, whether I was standing in a marine institute in Seymour studying an invasive species, or whether I'm working in UCD on an energy narratives project. I'm asking questions about how to problematize that space. So I suppose maybe just to touch on a project I'm working on at the moment. Sorry, I have a frog. Or to reference, I suppose, the project that was initially talked about, the biodiversity residency in DCC, funded through Creative Ireland. So the question, for me, I suppose I frame my practice around art is nature and nature is art. Nature, we talk about climate, but of course we need to reframe language around nature as a starting point. When I was approached to put in a proposal for the DCC residency, my obsession and my research has pivoted around hydrological lenses. How can we use different languages to talk about the terrestrial place we understand? I moved to things like blue humanities, hydrological storytelling, to really use lenses that reshift how we're thinking about the terrestrial spaces. So when I approached it, I asked, okay, how can we look at Dublin City through the hydrological lenses that underpin this city? It's a port city, it's a wet city. Some people refer to it as the Little Venice, but much of that is unseen. Just maybe a show of hands on people who know the meaning of the word Dochartaigh, for example. Yeah, so we understand it's the place of the hurdle ford, which is great to see it. And the language of Gaeilge, I suppose, took me on this journey around the city through language, through an understanding of place. And what I learned from that was that this city was built through material responses to place, such as reeds and wattle. A hurdle, for example, at Clea is a hurdle ford. It was the first crossing point on the River Liffey, which is Father Matthew Bridge now. But Clea also appears in the language of textiles and craft. To Kirkclea air is to darn your clothes or to mend something and to repair. So for me, water became this kind of space that could heal and could repair if we began to walk through some of the hydrological stories within this city. And 7 of them appeared as a sort of a GPS trail around the city as the output for that project. But yeah, I'll maybe move on to, because I know we're tight in time. And
Okay, yeah, look, thank you for that, Rosie. Actually, I think in terms of that discussion around art being different to nature, or is it, I think is something that we can sort of return to. But also the idea of language and place and languages and art giving us access to that, I think is important. So thank you for that. And we'll return to some of those issues as we go on. Next, we have Kerri. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
That was just glorious to listen to. It's absolutely gorgeous to be here. I'm really grateful to be given this platform. I am going to ask you all to do something now. I am going to ask you all to close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do so. And root your feet really firmly on the ground as best you can. And then I'm going to ask you to kind of lean back into the chair that's holding you, or the ground for those who are up there moving about. And I want you to imagine yourself as being really safely and firmly held by that structure, which in turn is held by the structure of the room and of this beautiful newly named building. When things are newly named, it's like they're newly born. So you're being held by this newly born building. And in turn, we can call the building's roots, their foundations are reaching right into the earth. And your being goes right the way down through and meets the being of the earth. It goes through all the substrata. And you can imagine little elves kind of pushing all of the sparkly things that exist in the earth out of the way. And you can imagine the different colours of the soil. And I want you to think of whatever colour you see that central part of the earth, our planetary home, as being, it'll be a different colour for any of you. The light that's there in that cave of the heart of the earth is a colour you'll know instantly, you'll recognise it. And I would now love you to imagine that in the very middle of that kind of heart cave of the earth, there's a tree growing, and its roots go the whole way down to the very bottom of that earth. And you just see the tree. Any tree, it can be a tree from your childhood, it can be a tree from the hospital that you gave birth to your first child in, it can be a tree from your grandmother's garden, it can be a tree from the school that you used to clamber out of, just a tree that is important to you and that you love. And I want you to feel that tree holding you in its really firm, loving arms. I want you to think about whether or not you've really thought about that tree recently, in recent times. Have you ever really given yourself the time to close your eyes to think about that elder in your life, that being who, I want to tell you something, that tree that you grew up with at whatever stage of your growing, maybe you only met that tree for 5 minutes, that tree still remembers you. And I would invite every single one of you to, when you get home or when you go off to have your break before you step back into that big world out there, I would invite you to lift a pen or a pencil. If you have a journal, if you don't, take your bus ticket. And I would just love you to give yourself and that tree some time together. A few words, or draw it. Any memories you have, pop it down. When you're ready, you can open your eyes back up and return yourself to yourself and this solid room and each other. And bet you weren't expecting that. What does art do for the world? What does it do for us? What is its legacy? What does it mean to live in a world where there is such ache and such grief and such loss and such destruction? But oh my goodness, the beauty. The beauty in what we've heard so far, in that world beating outside, in the blossom that's there, in the way that mothers are still sowing seeds in the ground in Palestine with their children, in the way that we continue and we continue and we continue. And I suppose for me, art is, I mean, it sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but art is Mother Earth, is my child, is all of you on the panel and all of you in the room, and the busman who was so funny and lovely and just wild yesterday when I met him, and all of that still happening at the same time as everything else around us. So I just want to kind of mention a few small things that have informed my practice. So I'm a mother, a holder of space, a writer and a grower. And I would say that the older I get, the more I understand that I know nothing. So I would say that for me, first and foremost, art reminds me that I know absolutely nothing and any answers are just ridiculous and it's all questions. So I would say that in a number of ways, I kind of return to these 3 T's of art. So the truth of art, this idea that we live in a world of such falsity at the hands of those who are in some kind of established power that in itself is not true and could vanish at any stage. So art kind of allows us to speak truth in a way that like almost nothing else in the world does, you know. Art allows us to kind of enter into the reality of the truth of our interconnectedness, our one anotherness. Like every single one of us is from a different place, but we all have a tree that we can think of when we close our eyes. That second T for me is trust. Trust is a really underrated thing, don't you think? It's like wild that we get up every morning and we get into a car. Like I just passed my test, and I find it wild that I'm allowed to drive myself and other people around the place. Like, but trust in art, that leaning back into the relationship between the perceived giver and the receiver, and the gift that is the truth of being alive. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this idea of all flourishing is mutual. I think art is what does that, because you have this complete dance between the giver and the gift, which is the art that you're channeling, and then the receiver. And that's, for me, that's glorious. That 30 is a really important one. And I want to quote a writer, Gargi Bacharaya, who wrote an incredible book that really influenced my work called We the Heartbroken. And the idea around her book is that we just have to accept that if we care about the earth, and if we care about human rights, if we care about art, we have to accept our complete brokenheartedness. Like, stop pretending about it. It is okay to wake up feeling heartbroken, but to still hold that hope within us. And so she talks about this idea of, imagine if I were really you, and you were really me, and these sort of false ideas of separation between us was gone, this myth of separation was gone, we would instantly enter into a state of such bliss that even thinking about losing that would be too much. And then that's where all these big-ended sort of organizations come in, and they prey on our heartbrokenness. They keep us further apart because they know we don't want to be far apart from each other. We want to live in community like the mosses do, like the trees do. So tenderness, that tenderness of the vulnerability of making art, the togetherness of making art, the interconnectedness, the ecologies of care that look like one person sharing their story and the other person holding space for them. And for me, that is really the joy of being alive as well as the ache of it. So, I am you and you are me, and we are moss and we are lichen, we are swans and we are fungi and we are trees and we are our gut biome, and most of all, we are really hopeful, beautiful creatures that just keep on keeping on, and art reminds us of that. So
Thank you very much, Kerri. As a lecturer, silence is so what you don't want in a lecture hall. And so brave of you to do that and to do it so well. So thank you very much for that. And also, I think the idea of focusing in on 3 words. And again, this is what art does, certainly for me, coming from a literary kind of background. Simple words, they don't need to be explained in many ways, but boy, don't they carry a punch. They're packed with potential meaning. Again, I think we'll be returning to aspects of that. And next up, Luke. You're not going to be silent, Luke, are you? Okay.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks, Kerri. I feel very grounded after that. So my name is Luke. I'm a performance maker. I'm from Longford originally, but I'm based in Dublin these days. And I make sort of multi-platform works that sort of look at the connection between a live audience and physical landscapes, and how do we sort of bring those two things together within the work. So I've made projects which have happened in all sort of manner of spaces, from beaches to people's back gardens to through city streets, and most recently in a bog in the Midlands of Ireland where I grew up. And I suppose for me, my introduction, I suppose, to making work around the environment was a personal one. So the community where I grew up in Longford is a big sort of Bord na Móna town, or was. So a lot of the sort of culture of that area was based around turf cutting and the peat extraction industry. And so over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been making work in response to the cessation of the peat harvesting industry. And it was kind of really interesting for me because my dad is a 3rd generation farmer. And as somebody who's been living in the city for quite a while, I kind of noticed this sort of tension between the people who were in that community, including my own parents. There was sort of this fear, I guess, around the closure of the peat harvesting industry, and the sort of socioeconomic impacts for the region, and what was the next chapter going to look like. But then on the other side of it, I was in sort of a lot of environmental circles where there was this huge positivity for the next sort of era of that landscape being allowed to rewild and be re-wetted. And so I suppose for me, the work that I make is trying to sort of carve out a space for both of those perspectives to be heard and to be facilitated. I suppose for me, like a tension that's always in my work is sort of the scale of the crisis itself, and then the sort of modesty of these kind of small interventions or acts that have sort of have meaning. And I suppose in a sort of conversation where there's often a pressure to be loud and quite activist or political in some ways, I suppose my practice is sort of looking at the idea of slowness and intimacy and care as a way of moving things forward. So I suppose that's probably where my practice sits. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that idea of your own sort of personal experience coming from a place that is in transition from an older world to a newer world, and again, perhaps art becomes a way to give that voice, to give that language, to give it some kind of, I suppose, space where we can understand it or begin to, I think is kind of interesting. Again, excellent. And finally, Ellen,
Yeah, thank you.
literary theorist.
Yes, yeah, well,
Thank
I have to say very much the odd one out on this panel, and thank you for three like already fabulous contributions. And I am very much not an artist, but I teach literature. I love the arts, and I think if anything, listening to the three of you speak, even without getting to see some of your fabulous art, which can be seen some of it outside, I think it just shows me and hopefully you how much poorer our lives would be without the arts. That it enriches our lives, and we can really forget that sometimes with this focus on economy, trade wars, all the things that are happening, but that actually, art is what makes life worth living, I think. So I suppose just thank you for that work and for kind of reminding me of that. So I teach in the School of English here. My background is literary studies. And one of the things that I teach is this idea of eco-criticism. So it's essentially where I'm asking students to look at a text or look at a piece of art and see, what can that tell us about the environment, or what might it have to say about the environment, or if it doesn't say anything about the environment, what might that tell us? So it becomes a kind of lens to look at art and to help us maybe understand things about how the environment is appearing in art itself. And particularly, I suppose, in relation to literature and poetry, which is what I teach and study most regularly, the environment is really intrinsic to how we write, how people write, and it appears in some of the very first poetry that humans ever wrote. They're looking around them and looking at their world. And I think for those of you here who aren't artists, probably most aren't like myself, you might, I think it's easier to engage with your environment through art, through, for example, we don't necessarily look at a daffodil and think, what are the chemical processes that make it yellow? But we might think of Wordsworth's daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud, the host of golden daffodils. Closer to home, Luke already mentioned the bog. Someone like Seamus Heaney, who I've done a lot of work on, spent most of his life writing about the bog. And I think we don't, that's more immediate. That gives us an emotion, that gives us a kind of reckoning. I was involved last year in an event here at DCU to commemorate 10 years since Healy died. And at that event, Barry Devlin, who was his brother-in-law and formerly of the Horselips, spoke and read two poems from Heaney's Loughney sequence. And he spoke about, before he read the poems, he spoke about the environmental destruction in Loughney, and he was grief-stricken. He was really overcome. And then when he went to read the poem, it was quite difficult because the poem, it was written kind of in the late 60s into the 70s, so a very different kind of environmental landscape at that time. But the poem, he even had a kind of changing relationship with that poem because it's one that he was reading his whole life, and in a way, what is described in that poem no longer exists. He talks about the flies, for example, and if you see any of the kind of flies kind of everywhere, any of the activist groups there, there are just no more flies on the lake anymore. And the poem itself becomes a sort of relic. So I think these are the type of things that, as someone who teaches and is involved in the arts, I think it's important for us to kind of think and talk about and realize that's how we often engage with our world around. And just as a kind of final note, one of the other things then that I was involved in with my colleague here, Dr. Cormac Cleary, trying to kind of think through some of these, some of these kind of big questions and the kind of maybe anxiety and grief that we're all feeling around the environment. We ran workshops here with staff and students in DCU who aren't artists either, but to take kind of articles about climate change or climate change research and to turn them into art. So we made collages, we made zines, we made blackout poetry with people working and studying here in DCU, and that some of those pieces are being exhibited outside as well. So it was really a really fun and cathartic in some ways workshop. So I'd really encourage people to go and take a look at them as well if they can.
Thank you, Ellen. So look, I've got a couple of questions before we sort of open it up to the audience. There was something Luke sort of said about scale, that the climate crisis is big. We as individuals are small, and that art in some way fills that space or tries to or begins to. But that idea of scale, so like in terms of the different types of art that each of you are involved in, like how is that a part of your art? Is that something that you think about? And how do you overcome that challenge? I'll begin with you, Kerri. Yeah.
I would begin by saying firstly that 1 is the biggest number because all the other numbers are born from 1. So we begin as 1. And in that respect, I would really say that once we have this idea that yes, the scale is massive and it is huge, but our scale is massive and huge as well. There's that saying, never underestimate the power of a small group of like-minded people. And I would say that art definitely is a way to return us to our own selves and to each other. And just that reminder that like the mycorrhizal links of being alive and community, care that is real and solid. Like it doesn't sound like artwork to turn up at someone's house with, or to join up in your local community to, for example, a food train for a new mother or for someone who's grieving. But you get 20 people together and they turn up over the course of a month with food. And that's art. That is taking your lived environment and making it more beautiful and more sustainable. And you just ramp that up a bit and you understand that we hold a lot of power, a lot more than what we allow ourselves to believe based on other people's actions. But like we hold a lot of power.
Right. Okay. So you think that the idea of art begins with one person, but it's about bringing people together or trying, yeah.
Yeah, or even just a reminder that you're not really one person. Like we all share a planetary home, and I really firmly believe that much as you have this idea that art making it's really solitary and it's really lonely, and it can be like that. But I believe as soon as you enter into kind of any kind of living dialogue with this living world, you just need to look at the way that moths are. Like we're told often that it's not good to ecologically to live in tight knit communities, but like you look at the natural world and moths thrive in those kind of ways, like an oak tree. An oak tree is a mother to 2,400 species of different beings. She's not going, you're not like me. You're a scarab beetle or you're a woodpecker. You know, I can't fly. She's just saying yes. Art's about saying yes. And I think we could learn a lot in being more oak.
Right. Um, I'll have to work on that. Rosie, in terms of that idea of scale.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, and I suppose I open talking about methodologies because I think it's important in the context of, I suppose, specifically being in an academic institution now, and I think transparency is really key. And that kind of mesh space that I try to describe, also what happens within that is this complete reflexible place, like where you're being mirrored all the time. And that for me was a crucial kind of stepping point into my arts practice, that I couldn't do anything without those questions being asked. So inevitably, it means when I think about material use or place or response, there is ethical questions to be asked. There's methodologies of care, there's decolonial practices, there's feminism. My art practice doesn't exist unless I'm interrogating that space fully. And I think that's where scale inevitably comes in. You know, if you get a huge commission and you want to build a big piece of sculpture, of course, that's a tantalizing idea. But then when you are embedded within this research space, which sees itself as a reflexive space that's always looking at itself and problematizing things, that isn't something I'm engaging with. With a last project, we bought some agricultural land to reforest specifically to challenge my impact through my practice. And we've planted over 1,000 trees and we're continuing to do so. And I work in analog because I don't want to have a digital footprint. I can see computers working here. This conference itself, I feel, should be more transparent about its digital footprint and the carbon offsetting or whatever project DCU is doing on it. One of the things that became key in the Dublin City Council residency was my involvement in the Rights of Nature campaign. I think that's a critical conversation to have in the context of a university. You know, where is nature at your board? Where is nature when you're getting research funding to the tone for your aeroplane innovation? Where's responsible innovation in the context of an academic institution? For me, methodologies of art methodologies, and that's why they're increasingly tagged on now to your. I say tagged because I'm cynical. Artists are still being treated as bottom feeders in a lot of these funding proposals, but they're tagged on to research proposals now at a European level because we know the models aren't working. We know the siloing is there, and we know the critical thinking needs to be embedded. So I think scale comes when you de-silo, you flatten hierarchies, and you apply radical thinking.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosie. Yeah. So, Luke, in terms of your response, I mean, you raised that issue of scale. Like any sort of practical kind of sense of how you overcome that challenge.
Yeah, well, like, I suppose the first thing I'll say about it is, like, I think at this moment in time, as we're sort of being asked to radically reshape and sort of rethink the way we live, I think, like, the imaginative possibilities of, like, an artistic practice offer sort of, like, I suppose aren't just relevant, but they're so vital. In terms of my own work, I suppose I would say that I'm always really interested in cultivating sort of languages of, like, feeling and ritual and memory within the work, which I think helps sort of embody scientific research. And I think alone scientific research can't really access that sort of emotional sort of feeling aspect of what moves things along often. I also think, just to kind of pick up on what Rosie was saying as well, in terms of which was something I kind of discovered through, because I was just after Rosie doing a residency in Dublin City Council, And there's so much, not just in Dublin City Council, but I suppose widespread, the language we use around sort of the environment and nature and biodiversity even can be so unwelcoming sometimes, I think. And it's something I notice with my own parents as well, in that like just the language can alienate a lot of people so much. So I think creating a welcoming space is super important as well, in terms of bringing hearts and minds into it as well. But like also resisting this idea of Puritanism and sort of nativism, that and the sort of colonial language almost that surrounds a lot of it, in terms of invasive and non-native as an inherently negative thing, you know, the outsider as evil or troublemaker. That sort of really emerged for me. But to give you one example of a project that I made a couple of years ago with another artist called Shanna May Breen, we made a project called Mold into Shape, which was a project looking at our human relationship to plastic as a material. So through that project, over the course of 10 weeks, myself and Shanna, we did a beach clean on Killiney Beach. So we scoured the beach for 10 weeks and we collected, I think, over 200 pieces of small washed up pieces of tactile plastic. So everything from like bottle caps to little Ken doll foots and all sorts of things. But what we did was, it was a soundscape that happened on the Dart. So the audience met at Pier Street Dart Station and we brought them all the way out to Killiney Beach. And then each audience member was gifted a small piece of the tactile plastic that we collected to look after for the next 10,000 years, which is the sort of time scale of how long a piece of plastic takes to biodegrade. But I suppose that would be just one example of that sort of like quiet, maybe intervention, in the sense of like inviting somebody to look at something slightly different is something I'm always really interested in doing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and this will be my second sort of thing for everybody. But again, just in terms of that reaction. So when you create something in that instance and bringing people out in the dirt and giving them a piece of plastic to mind for 10,000 years, what's their reaction to that? Did they say to you, "What are you doing? This is crazy," or "I get it now"? What is their response to your art?
The reaction is, I think, of the same reaction as receiving a gift almost, you know, the way. It's kind of looking at I think audiences go with you, you know, the way you're kind of, for me anyway, like what I'm always trying to do through the work that I make is try to make conversations around the environment and the world, I suppose, more broadly intelligible through the artwork, and to kind of almost take the audience member by the hand and kind of go like, invite them to see what I'm seeing, you know. And so the giving of the gift, I suppose, of the piece of plastic is met with acceptance and sort of like intrigue, you know, the way. Yeah, maybe some people said I was crazy, but they didn't say it to my face. So yeah,
They probably put it on Facebook. Anyway, yeah.
but lots of people actually did come up to me after that project and said, I still have my little piece of plastic
Right, okay.
on my desk. And this was like 2 years later. So that was nice to hear. The people that did look after it.
Well, there you go. And but also it's the idea that it is like a physical thing that reminds them of that day and so on, and the message, as it were. But Kerri, in terms of the response that you might get from readers of your work, or
I think that generally most people really do want to take on board the ideas that we're all bringing up. I think like generally that is true. People from all kind of walks of life, people of all ages. I think like what I'd be interested in seeing happen is just like even more full-blown, deep-hearted accessibility in the arts. So kind of not singing to the converted, and even not even really singing at all, like more kind of a full-blown let's all get together and write our own piece type of thing. And so that's why it's really great to see kind of projects popping up that are a lot more kind of, yeah, sort of intergenerational, and kind of what you'll see is a lot of local councils are funding, yeah, like stuff between elders and really young children, storytelling sheds and things like that. That's kind of where I'm wanting to push towards. I love, like, I mean, we're all great. We all love to have a wee pat on the shoulder and be told how wonderful we are. But like, that's not really the reality. I don't really care about that. And moving into this elder part of my own lifetime, I'm beginning to more feel like I want to move even more out of the ego and even more towards like art for its real purpose.
Okay. Rosie?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about specific projects. I think probably the first large-scale installation I did was on Sandymount Strand. I grew up there, and I listened to so many people walk the beach there and say, "Oh, I didn't know the tide came in here." For me, it was. I mean, I was very lucky to live there, but it's a slow incoming tide. Regularly, you'll see the RNLI come to collect people who've got stranded out on, and we'd have a beer on our wall and watch it all happen and unfold in front of us. But I made a piece that was called 4 of 704 that marked the 4 of the 704 annual high tides. But it was built as a dive vat that was about 200 meters out on the coastal area. And they had shipping containers that acted in a kind of a cylinder that rose and fall with the high tide. And within it were these dresses that had been crafted with local community groups, and they were literally dyed using logwood, which is a dye that can dye using cold water, not hot water. So we used local pigments. We made the pigments, and it was done on a full moon. So you had to walk it at midnight on a high tide, and the moon, of course, performed first. And we had this spectacular full moon, silent headphones where you could engage with this piece and literally watch the tide rise and fall. And it was videoed by a friend of mine, and I mean, I was so embedded in it because we did it all by hand. I had an engineer. First of all, I didn't know how difficult it was to build in quicksand. I'm sure there's engineers in the room now going, "What were you doing?" But I had an amazing engineer who had the army on hold with sandbags for me, ready to prop it up for the performance. It was for the Dublin Fringe Festival, and it didn't happen. And it was a smooth incoming tide, and we had no wind, and it was a magical time. But in the video, people were literally sitting there with tears rolling down their face, just listening and watching the tide, and of course staring at a full moon and connecting with that for the first time. But in contrast to that, also just in the research context, I worked in CMAR, which is one of the big marine institutes in Porto, and I was tracking an invasive seaweed, which is a Japanese kelp that's now making its home around the warm waters of Ireland as well. But at the time, it was in Porto. And when I was there, I was researching with a camera and a video. I didn't have great Portuguese. I found out afterwards they thought I was making a video, so they were all getting their nails done. And they were very shocked eventually to see what I did produce, which was I built hydrophones and actually recorded the lab experiments happening in the lab where they were dissolving sea urchin shells using acid to see what temperature and what pH level would the ocean have to change for this to have a dramatic effect on sea urchin populations, because they, of course, are the people who eat the invasive seaweed. And after I performed it to them, and I had recorded it and I embedded, I suppose I was trying to bring these two worlds together, the world of research, but also the world of this invasive species. Luke has talked poetically about how we need to reframe that. And afterwards, one of the scientists came up to me and he said, "I've never put emotion to my data before. This was the first time I've had that opportunity, and thank you." So I think that's, again, the power of the senses, and art is the world of the senses, the world of experience. And when it steps into that place, it can have a radical shift. And they after I left, they continue to have artist researchers in this marine institution, CMAR, which will hopefully problematize and continue to ask questions about the role art plays in research creation, for example.
Okay, thank you for that, Russell. And so, Ellen, when you're teaching poetry from an eco-critical perspective, what is the students' response?
Yeah, I think it's something that they haven't. Actually, I will say I do think students nowadays, compared to myself when I was in college, I think I was a bit oblivious. I do think students nowadays are quite engaged, and it's really the young people who will be dealing with a lot of the consequences, unfortunately. So I think they're very open to it. It does mean a new way of reading and a new way of seeing. So I think, that can be a bit of a challenge, but I sometimes try and describe it, something like feminism is a lens that helps us to think about gender and think about women. And this is just I always say we're putting on our feminist glasses, we're putting on our eco-critical glasses to try and what what comes out with those lenses, what's jumping out, and what's kind of made more clear with a different kind of lens. But I think, to me, what's coming across from this panel, and maybe that question around scale again, is that art connects us. It connects us to emotions, like the data scientist who hadn't thought about the emotional, but it also connects us to other people, and whether that's taking part in an event, like both Kerri and Rosie were describing, or coming away with something like Luke says, to have a kind of physical thing. But even, I mean, I'm always kind of struck if I go to a museum or anything, a painting that's been there for 200, 300, 400 years. Well, I'm looking at it the way somebody 400 years ago also looked at it. And I think that's such a privilege, really, to be able to do that. And just, I suppose, again, to remind ourselves the importance of art in our lives, whatever form that might take.
Okay, thank you for that, Ellen. I think we've got a bit of time for questions or comments from the audience. I think, someone up there that, and then you.
Hi there. Thanks very much. I loved all the different presentations, but my question is really about the role of art in protest and opposition and resistance. I'm not quite ready to just give up. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us maybe some examples of projects you worked on. And I'm thinking, just in terms of examples, of that amazing work done by the artist whose name I can't remember, to highlight the opioid epidemic in the US. So she gathered up all these prescriptions and tore them up, and then kind of released them down above sort of an elite audience who were kind of forced to confront the reality of it. And very, very powerful and symbolic, but it was an act of protest as well.
Anybody want to jump in there? Protest.
Yeah, it was Nan Goldwyn, and she also had been prescribed opiates, so she was she was heavily involved in that campaign. I mean, I think the next panel, there's definitely going to be a focus on activism as well and the arts. From my own perspective, even when we were working in the not-for-profit sector and human rights sector, it was the visual culture of arts that inevitably led to the greatest impact. Whether that was our flash mobs on the streets of Dublin around high street stores, or any of the kind of large-scale protests we did, it was the ability to visually communicate a kind of a story that had the most power. But also brings hope. I think that was mentioned in the last panel as well. Rachel Solnit has that brilliant book, Hope in the Dark, where she talks about the inevitability of progress, and this kind of idea that hope is the thing that will creep through and challenge the inevitability of where we're going. And I think those visible actions of protest that come through kind of usually deep-seated, like Nan had a huge personal experience with that campaign and knew how to communicate it. So it does take an embeddedness, and it's not something that can happen. I think, people presume that they happen at maybe the flash, or everyone sitting around having a cup of tea saying we'll do that. Usually they are from an embedded experience within a situation or a place, or like a relationship to land. So
Anybody else?
Yeah, I can come in just to say, I think it's a really interesting question. This sort of it's just making me think about, so much of like making art is messy and complicated and ambivalent, and there's sort of all of those considerations that go with making an artwork. And then you have this sort of idea of environmental legacy within the, like, I can only speak of my own work, and I mean there's always an environmental legacy within it in some small way, whether it's sort of gifting an audience like a piece of tactile plastic, or I made a project a few years ago in which we planted a small forest of 1,000 trees in the centre of Ireland, in response to Ireland having the lowest tree cover in Europe at that time, and I believe we still do. But sort of the kind of positive environmental action within the work has been the way I have sort of embedded an element of activism within the work. it wouldn't be my it wouldn't be me to be sort of loud or like really pushy or sort of or kind of overtly political in that sense. So I think sort of quieter forms of protest are interesting as well in terms of how do you how do you bring people in? I suppose it as well depends on who you're trying to speak for the work to speak to. Yeah, who the audience is. I think is it's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That this person here. Just yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panel. It's been extremely interesting. I'm just interested in the rights of nature and taking what Ellen said about the Loch Ness sequence and the relic of the poem by Seamus Heaney and thinking about the shifting baseline. And then I think, Ellen, you also said that if you're looking at a painting in a museum, you're looking at it through the same eyes as someone before you. But really you're not, because you're looking at it in a different context. You're looking at a reduced nature from what was there previously, and that's your experience. And I'm thinking about all of that, and I'm thinking about, as an environmentalist myself, been working in the area since the mid-90s, looking at all the environmental trends declining year on year on year. And now you're talking about Seamus Heaney's poem as being a relic, you know. And I'm wondering, could Seamus Heaney's poem have saved Loch Ness from its fate?
Okay.
I mean, there's a famous quote that poetry makes nothing happen. So I'm not quite sure about that. He actually did allow some of his bog poems to be used by environmental groups as a sort of as part of their kind of activism and protest. I'm not sure if that poem itself could have saved Loch Ness, but it's still something I'm actually thinking about in my own work. But if that poem is now a relic, what does that mean? What do we do with that? And that idea of shifting baselines, you know, do we want to go back to the Loch Ness of that poem or the Loch Ness even before that? Because it was already, you know, now that we look back, we know that it was already in decline. But it's, I suppose, it's there as a kind of artistic piece that has a lot of emotion in it. So I think if it's something, it can be maybe something to look to, but I don't know if
You know, yeah, because I'm thinking about can art change the outcome of an environmental situation, or how can we as environmentalists help you as artists change our environmental outcome, I suppose is my question, just cloaked in Seamus Heaney.
I don't know if there's any. Do you want to say something, Rosie? Yep.
I mean, I think I'm answering your question a bit, but I do think there's a role around transparency. Just the project I was working with, like you're talking about an extractive, like a landscape of extractivism, and we are now facing a future of extractive futures in Ireland, and like we heard, of course, about mining in the first presentation. But I really do think researchers also have to step up. Academic researchers have to step forward and step outside of their funding kind of paradigms and share maybe some of the insights into something like mining sites around Ireland, wind turbine plans around Ireland. When I was working on this energy project, I found these maps produced by a private company called Laten, and they produce all of the prospective mining maps of Ireland and wind maps, data centres. I'd never seen them, and they weren't being introduced to me by the academic team that I was working with, and I had to introduce them in to have that conversation. And I was shocked that they weren't something that were being put on the table when we were working with communities in Moneypoint or Kilrush or in the sites of data centres in Tala. I think that's to put it back on maybe academic research that has funding to look at something like renewable energy. These are the things that the public need to see, that environmental activists need to see, so that we have true transparency around the extractive future that this country is basing its next 50 years of economic development around, for example.
Okay. We've got some. Yeah. So that person there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for some really fascinating presentations. I'm curious about the use of language and the invitation by the panel to reframe. And there's something I'm curious to get your views on English as a language of separation. And it's been captivated by capitalism. And we talk about targets, deadlines, as if somebody's going to die if we don't make it. Strategy is the language of war. So I'm really curious about how the potential for English or maybe language to be a language of interconnectedness and reframing it in a completely different way, because we've created this false narrative of the separation of humans from nature, and we're not part of nature, we are nature.
Can I take that one? That is just so gorgeous to hear. And I really deeply believe that language is how we do these things. Kind of touching back on your thing, like can a poem save a stretch of land? Absolutely yes. Like I do believe that moving forward, we do need to really sit with what colonialism has done to us as well as to the world around us. And yeah, absolutely. Like what we've lost through, there are people still living who were like forced out of their native tongue, their mother tongue. There are still people being forced out of their mother tongue around the earth. There are still, like I just watched a thing before we came in on dialects within Scottish universities and how like people are laughed out of the room when they say poem instead of poem. And I firmly believe that anything that we can do that removes this myth of separation from our universities, from our institutions, from the ways that we interact with each other. Owen DeBard, an incredible Irish traveller writer, at a conference or at an event I put on in Dunleary, he said really early in, like, see this panel crack where you're speaking at this stage and you're speaking at this stage. That doesn't exist within my heritage and my background. And actually, what's viewed as more respectful in old Irish traveller ways is that we're connected. We're in a web together as we sit here. So, like, if I speak over someone, that's okay. Like, this is a living web of reality. And children are the ones that teach us the way back into language. Like the stuff that children say before we tell them, oh, you're not really meant to say that. Or like, actually, do you know what? So maybe it's to do with deeper than just English. Like how we allow ourselves to be with each other really needs to change, I believe. And just needs to be more love-led. And that's doable.
Thank you. I think there was some. Yeah, up at the back, just there on the right there. Yeah. My writer.
Thank you so much for all your comment, for everything that you guys said. And my question is going to be more probably regarding the visual arts and the arts itself. What do you find the most challenging in the delivery process to the wider audience, like in terms of your arts, to connect it with an environment and like to bring the awareness wider to the audience outside? Like, for example, what I mean is there are people who would like to hear and would like to participate in changes, but there are people who are not aware, or there are people who are kind of closed. So what are your challenges and how do you deal with them while you're delivering the messages regarding the climate change and the environment connection and like all of those things? Thank you.
Gotta go. Yep.
Yeah, I can respond to that. Although I'll just say, I suppose my own practice is performance rather than strictly visual arts. But I can certainly identify with what you're saying there in terms of, how do you bring people along, if I've understood correctly, or how do you bring people make people feel welcome within what you're trying to sort of share? For me, I've really noticed that the personal is the most powerful in terms of in terms of sharing a story or a message. Like I recently made a project called Distillation, which was made in response to the peat harvesting industry where I grew up closing down. So I collaborated with a perfume maker over 18 months to create a perfume made from botanicals we collected from the bog. But I interviewed loads and loads of different people as part of that, including my own dad. And really that really informed so much of the work. And also what ended up happening was myself and me and my dad would have like fairly different viewpoints on the landscape where we grew up. He's kind of a sort of mindset where the land has always been used for agricultural purposes, and so it has to be continued to be used for that, whereas I'd have a very different perspective. I'm like, Dad, just plant a forest. But what ended up happening was a really meaningful conversation between me and my dad emerged from that around sort of him reforesting the land, and sort of that's still an ongoing conversation. But I suppose that will be maybe just one example of like, it was really personal, you know, the way, and that really, I felt like, instigated a spark in him to change something that maybe wouldn't have come about through maybe him listening to just information on the news about it or listening to academic research. In the same way, loads of people who I've encountered after that particular performance, we've had really, really meaningful conversations around, like, you know, even though it's talking about a very specific place in Ireland, that story of a landscape being kind of scourged and stripped, you know, over many decades is applicable in loads of different places in Ireland and internationally. And people have kind of gone like, well, that's the story of where I grew up too. And it's also the story of, you know, this place as well. And it's kind of just, yeah, I suppose sparking those conversations. I mean, it's impossible to offer the answer, you know, but if you can spark the question and sort of start a dialogue, I think that's a good place to start from.
Okay, folks, our revels now are ended. We have it's now 1:20 and we need to eat, I suppose, for the next session to begin at 2:00. So listen, I want to thank Luke, I want to thank Kerri, Rosie and Ellen for a wonderfully enlightening